trying to approach the question, what is design? Well, that's a big question. So let's ask another question, why does it matter? And then maybe a third, how do we get there? So I'm going to try to help you navigate this terrain. Design is, I think, very important and under-recognized by most people in our time. And so let's ask ourselves, why does design matter? Well, first of all, I think it matters aesthetically. That's pretty easy. Most of us can imagine, if you look at a design magazine, whether it's a clothing design or Architectural Digest or Elle Home or any of these magazines, they are about a style, an aesthetic character. It may be associated with an individual person or an individual person would like to imagine themselves to be. But it matters aesthetically, but it matters otherwise too. I would argue that it matters emotionally, that you can derive, and this, by the way, this may seem light or frivolous at the beginning of this semester. I can assure you, after we've met with some of the people who are going to be visiting us, who are tasked with adding tremendous value to the companies and the brands that they work with, that this idea about design mattering emotionally is extremely. And if you can derive some joy or enthusiasm from a product, a thing, an experience because of design, that can be enormously helpful. And as a result, it matters commercially. It matters, and those of you who are in business, and actually all of us are aware of business in the modern era, the idea of value being added through brand identity and the like is critical. I mean, we can look no further than Apple computers, for example, where people are willing to pay 2, 3, 4 times as much for a product that at many levels does kind of the same thing as things that cost a lot less. But why do people pay? Because there's something else they're getting. There's something else they're getting. I would say that design matters intellectually, in the sense that a well-designed product can present itself, and not just a product, a well-designed process, a well-designed environment, can advance feelings of clarity, precision, order, and so it matters intellectually. It certainly matters operationally. If you think about a well-designed campus, a well-designed factory, a well-designed course, a well-designed day. If it is well-designed, it is more efficient, it is coordinated, and has some kind of focus. I would say design matters experientially. And this is very important. In terms of comfort, ease of use, if you think about what is, and I'm going to show you several examples of this, fear not, but what do we even mean by well-designed? So the first thing we're just asking is why does it matter? And I think there are lots of reasons that it matters, but here's the big caveat for this course. It also matters personally, and what you're getting in this course is not an objective reality like physics. There's not a single right answer in design. There's a way of looking at the world. There are better ways than others, and the architecture students in here know exactly what I'm talking about. In other words, their task is not like they finish their work at 2:30, 2:45 in the morning, and then say, that's done, and never say that. Because it's never really done. There's another iteration, there's another circling back to understand it. But let's have a look at what we mean by this. This is a Greek bronze of Medusa's head done 2,000 years ago. I'm just going to show you a few images. This, the architecture students might recognize this. This is Etienne Boulay, the French architect. Etienne Boulay's monument to Isaac Newton. This was, Newton had transformed people's understanding of the universe in the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment felt it needed to be acknowledged and noted. By the way, in just over a week, the designer of the World War II memorial on the Mall in Washington, I think it's on the 18th, Friedrich St. Florian. It's going to be a fantastic conversation about how you design a memory for a whole nation. Really interesting. But this is Etienne Boulay's Newton Cenotaph. By the way, this is the scale. Those are people down by those asterisks. Okay, there it is. Those are the people. All right? Just to give you a sense of how big a deal they thought this was. And this was to be the inside. The outside would look like the world. The inside would look like the universe. Right at the center, and all the headings would be displayed on the inside. Have any of you ever been to the Maparian down at the Christian Science Center? If you haven't been, you really should go. It's right 3 or 4 blocks from here. And it's the same concept. It's a map of the world. In this case, a map of the world, not a map of the universe. It's the map of the world, but instead of the images of the countries being on the outside, they're on the inside. So you're walking into a sphere. And the only thing that's a little bit weird about it now is that it was done, I think, in the 1930s. So there's a bunch of names of countries that are not right. Like a disturbingly large number of names of countries that are not right. But I'm pointing these things out because I think the first several images I just showed you are things that have that are objects and spaces in this case, both an object and a space, of a very, very simple form that most people would say is an elegant design, a pure design. There are lots of other things that are very well designed, like pencil sharpener. This is a pencil sharpener designed by Raymond Loewy in the 1930s. Raymond Loewy is a very famous American industrial designer who also designed Studebaker and Avanti automobiles. He designed very streamlined locomotives. So very interesting designer. This is some of his, he designed everything. There's a lot of people who design products who design across a tremendous range of objects. Now there are other kinds of designers, like architects, who design in a narrower range. But then there are people who, what we can call systems designers, who design at across an incredibly broad area of subject matter, at the very least. Loewy is also responsible for the logo for Shell Oil. And if you've ever been over to Cambridge, you may have seen this incredible sign, which was recently redone, which is that same logo at about 5 stories tall. Excuse me. And this is an Avanti automobile designed by Raymond Loewy. This is another automobile designed by Norman Bell Geddes, a kind of experimental idea for a car. And you might say, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? This thing appears to have 8 wheels and a really giant tail fin in the middle. What is it about? Well, this is an idea about imagining a vehicle that is meeting different performance criteria than the ones that existed at the time. And we're going to get to more of this in a second. But I'm hoping that in this first meeting, I can share with you some of the ways that designers do what they do. Again, some people in this room have already practiced design in one form or another, and I don't know. I know the architecture students have, and there are probably others of you that have as well in various ways. But we'll see in a minute some of the ways that people use
to innovate and come up with new design approaches that solve problems better than they have in the past. You all have seen these, of course, segways. This is really interesting, I think, because they haven't really caught on in this country for a lot of regulatory reasons, I think. But they're a really interesting idea, and the reason is that this is an attempt to create something that is a vehicle, yes, but it's the most like walking you can do without walking. I mean, this, of course, to be fair, this is an answer to a problem that perhaps America doesn't have, which is that people are getting too much exercise. That's maybe not the actual, maybe this isn't focused on the correct problem. But it's nonetheless interesting because, unlike a bicycle or a motor scooter or something like that, where I drive and I stop and I get off of it and I go do what I'm going to do, the idea of the Segway was, what if we made a vehicle that was just as intuitive, that I operated the same way I walk around. I just lean and do what comes naturally. And that way when I stop, it doesn't fall over. I'm still standing up. If you've seen these things around town, as I have, they can come to a stop and you're standing up. You don't put your foot down to keep from falling over. It remains balanced. And the idea is that this supplanted your regular locomotion system, but didn't give up the other qualities of the locomotion system. So this is a very good example to me of identifying an interesting problem that no one else had identified yet. So there aren't a bunch of well, maybe there are now. There weren't a bunch of competitors to the Segway because it was not a problem that anyone else had recognized. The great Charles and Ray Eames. You may have seen, if you watch PBS, you may have seen a special that they had on this husband and wife design team from the mid-century a while back. But whether you've seen it or not, you've probably seen a version of this chair and ottoman somewhere in your visual life, because they became so immensely popular as really luxurious chaise lounge chairs. And the reason that they were sort of very innovative at the time is this. This is molded plywood, and it was a technology, believe it or not, that did not really work until right after the Second World War. In fact, these guys were involved with trying to do bent plywood furniture because it was really affordable, and they thought very elegant and modern, and they hoped very comfortable. So they were hoping to have modern, factory-made, and comfortable, all in the same sentence, all in the same product. And it wasn't until after World War II that they were able to do this, and that's when this really took off. Let's contrast that with my good friend Gerrit Rietveld, who is one of the great Dutch architects of the De Stijl period in the teens and 20s of the 20th century. And this is also a chair, but it's solving a different problem. How can you make an abstract primary color painting? And you just have to understand a lot of what design is about. Design is a lot more like writing or sports, I would say. I'm talking about the act of designing now, than it is like math or physics, right? The idea that there's a single right answer. There's one of the somewhat hilarious to an architect, one of the somewhat hilarious studies that was done in the 60s about design thinking looked at how differently architects and engineers thought. Okay, for the engineers in the audience, this is a perennial tussle because even though both architects and engineers work in the built environment, they work around buildings often, they don't actually do the same kind of stuff. Engineers are generally about focusing down on the best possible answer within a slice of a project. Architect's job is usually to choreograph a clear story for the whole project. Those are very different enterprises. And even though to the outside world, or when you're, by the way, since I meet with so many prospective students coming out of high school, when you're in high school, it looks like they're basically the same thing. But in fact, they're very different. Anyway, I don't think there are very many engineers who would design a chair this way. Really, it's hard for me to imagine what the performance criteria would be that would cause an engineer to design a chair that looks like this. By the way, this is the most singularly uncomfortable chair in human history. I've sat in it. But you have to understand what it's trying to do. I mean, if Riedvel's objective was to make them a chair that is as comfortable as this, we wouldn't be talking about him today. Okay. Anyway, so these are just some. We're just sort of touring as an intro to this course. We're doing a little touring through the world of design, and mind you, this conversation is biased towards the world of product design and architecture and so forth, in a way that the course is not. Okay, it's just easier to talk about objects briefly because you can look at them and understand them quickly. Has anybody ever seen something like this before? No? Messerschmitt. If that name sounds familiar, these are the people who built German warplanes in the Second World War. Then the war was over, and they had all these factories. Well, they didn't have, not all the factories were still there, of course, but they had some know-how and maybe a few parts. And they needed to bring their economy back. Well, so they started, and there was a need, and people didn't have a lot of money, and so there was a need for low-cost transportation that took advantage of the fact that they had this manufacturing capability. So they built this three-wheeled little thing, and by the way you get in it is the top opens up and you climb in like a cockpit. This is like the fuselage of a little jet with wheels on the bottom, and I just think it's really great. It's a motorcycle plus an airplane equals a car. So that's how to think about it. Now, not all good design is modern in the sense that you would recognize in terms of style. Monet rocker, I would say, is brilliantly designed because it takes a decorative motif, the swirling lines, and reuses it as the way you rock. In other words, the chair rocks on the very structure of its decoration. And one of the things we're going to get at, for sure, is the idea that good design almost always solves more than one problem at a time. In other words, to be an excellent design, something has to synthesize more than one thing. And oftentimes, the things we think are brilliantly designed are the things that solve multiple problems in one move. And this is an example of something that I think does that very nicely. Huh? What's he doing here? This is from the film Minority Report. Some of you probably saw it. It is a touch screen. I'm not sure we really had touch screens in regular commercial marketplace when this came out, because it was surely 10 years ago. And it's interesting just because, if you remember, Tom Cruise is up there solving lots of problems, on this touch screen. But it's also basically a mirror. In other words, they invented, for the purposes of this movie, a way. What were their needs? We need to look futuristic and high tech. What are we going to do? We need to see Tom Cruise. We've got to be able to see him. We can't have an opaque thing in front of him. And so how about we'll just script everything right on the screen? That's a design solution, it seems to me. In other words, there were deliverables. There were project deliverables for this scene. And they came up with, for example, how do we know that there's a screen there? Well, when he touches it, there's got to be some indication visually so we can see it. That's a design solution, it seems to me. We don't even know what this screen does, okay? Let's be clear. We have no idea if it does anything. But it needs to appear to be doing something. And the way for that to be is for these colors to emerge when his fingers touch the screen. So I told you we're just day tripping through the world of design here. So let's go to the world before the euro. And this is what Dutch money looked like. This is a 50 guilder note. And the Dutch are incredibly obsessed with design. That's why I love going there. It's just amazing. And they had, I would argue, the most beautiful money in the world. And they loved doing it. So they would change their money completely every 5 or 10 years, just because they enjoyed making another set. And I just think this is, you might say, well, this just looks like a painting. What's the big deal? Well, no, actually, it's weaving a variety of the security measures that you need to protect your currency into, the colored metal band that exists in large banknotes. That's right down in here. These various patterns that make it extremely difficult to reproduce, to copy the money. But then at the end of the day, and it's incredibly legible. By the way, they also, this is, the U.S. has really started changing its money finally after a very long time. But very incrementally, you'll notice. We don't go orange all of a sudden, right? But these also, they had a number of other performance criteria. They had tactile qualities. The idea was that blind people should be able to handle this money and know exactly what they were holding. And so the notes were different sizes. They had textures on them. It's really quite impressive. So this whole thing was kind of a tableau of imagery and performance that is one of the things that I would say marks great design. Of course, we all know about our poor friend the mouse, whose primary role was to serve as the model for this. I think the reason that the mouse worked so well it was something that was small, cute, friendly. That's not what we thought of technology. Oh, a mouse. A mouse, that's cute. It's not going to hurt me. That'll be fine. If we'd said a python or a viper, it might have been a different thing altogether. Now, I told you that this travelogue through design was a bit personal. This is Arne Jacobsen, a Scandinavian designer who designed this incredibly, I would say, beautiful cutlery. Now, I would also go on to say, great design can be biased towards solving one set of problems better than another. This beautiful silverware, until 9/11, when they don't have metal silverware on the planes anymore, prior to 9/11, Alitalia always had this silverware, and I thought, oh my God, what a sophisticated airline. I don't care how much they charge. If I get to use this silverware, it'll be worth it. And I can imagine somebody going, that's what I'm talking about. But then they had some other problems, like they really couldn't run an airline. So there was that. But there's another problem, which is, can you tell me what you think it might be? They weren't very good utensils. I admit that in solving multiple problems, it was kind of barely solving the practical problem of eating, while it was really elegantly solving the other problem of looking great on the table. Well, and the fork is the least of the problem. I mean, it goes downhill from there. Believe me, if you try to spoon a liquid with these practically knives over here, you could be facing a real problem. So I thought I'd give you one example of where the aesthetic criteria might go a little bit farther than they ought to. Here's an example of something that hits the ball right out of the park. This is the same designer. This is his so-called womb chair. And you know what? That's exactly what it is. I mean, this just envelops you. And you've probably seen these. The reason it has lasted for 60 years is that it is one of those things that really performs as it was conceived. And for designers, the idea of a metaphor like that can be super powerful, because if you think only about a chair, your mind goes to an already fixed understanding of what a chair is. If you think about a chair as an experience, maybe sitting as an experience, or you write out the story of an experience that you want to have or you think that people would like to have, you can find yourself defining design objectives that are very different. Let's jump to something else altogether. Can any of the architecture students tell me where this is? Yes? No? Good guess, though. It is in Italy. Palma Nova. Palma Nova, Italy, is the home of the most example of the geometric defense fortifications that were the stock and trade of the little city-states in this region for several hundred years. There were no bombers, there were no rockets. And if you could just keep the marauding army away from your town, you were okay. And the way to do that was through this complex series of fortifications. But this is a great example of a design that is extremely performance-driven. And indeed, I would say, as architecturally beautiful as it is, this is really an engineering design. There is a right answer to this question, which is, what is the perfect angle that allows me to project out into the landscape enough so that I can shoot arrows back on the people who are trying to climb the walls, or pour boiling oil on them, or do whatever it is that we do. And how many points should this star have, and all of that sort of business. This is considered the greatest example of that kind of defensive fortification. Okay, now let me segue slightly. Can anybody tell me, does anybody know this image? This is a contemporary British artist called Andy Goldsworthy. And he is like no other. What he does is he takes items found in nature and then recomposes them into compositions and takes a photograph of them. They are ephemeral. They do not last. They can't, because the situations he creates do not exist in nature, but he composes them of natural things. So what this is a series of leaves hand-stitched together with little pieces of wood, these little things here, and then arrayed, floating on a river, and then a photograph taken of them. And so what you might say, well, what is this? Well, I would say this is, in some ways, the essence of design. This is, he has made none of this. The only thing he has done is composed and conceived of the context in which we will understand this. All right, there is no task for this. There is nothing for this to perform other than to be beautiful. And it exists for a moment, and then it's gone. Now, that's not true of most design. I'm just saying that this does tease out some of the extraneous variables, which I think is very interesting. And his work is absolutely arresting. This is a spiraling piece of ice that he crafted around a tree. Now, I just think, who thinks of such a thing? And I guess the answer is, he wanted to find something that reinforced what he saw as the beauty of simply the shaft of this tree. I know you're looking at it, you're going, okay, that's cool, but wait a minute, how the hell? What? Okay, I think that, is that what you're thinking? Because that's what I thought when I saw this. And, I think he had to literally sort of create a mold for this, and then drip water on it, let it freeze, drip more water on it, let it freeze, drip more water on it, let it freeze, until it got to here. Because I don't think there's any other way to do this. And then this is my favorite. This is, in the desert, this rock outcropping He collects and finds the hundreds of little yellow flower heads, attaches them to the contour of the rock outcropping, takes a picture of it, and that's the end of it. What I think is so gorgeous about it, of course, is that all of the colors are found in nature because it is nature, except it's not nature that anybody other than the designer put together. Okay. How many of you have seen this image before? There we go. Familiarity. And you know the shtick with this, right? You can only understand it one way at a time. Either it's the old woman looking down, like this. Here's my nose, here's my nose. Old woman looking down. Or it's the young woman turning away, right? Your brain can't process both at the same time. You can't see them both at the same time. You just can't. Because your brain has to construct, your brain has to understand that as a nose and that as a jawline, and this is the face of the woman turning away. But if it's of the woman looking down, that has to be the nose, and that's the nostril, and that's a bit of the eye. So it's interesting. It's a cognitive thing. You simply can't understand both things at the same time. And what's interesting is that often you need to, as a designer, you need to take some control over your own perception. And I'm going to talk about decontextualizing things here in a second because it's so important. I've got a good friend, Jack Hitt, who's a regular on This American Life. If you ever want to look up his stuff, he's absolutely the best storyteller in the country. Hilarious. He has a one-man show right now called Making Up the Truth. And at first you might think, oh, well, that's just some flip thing. No, actually, it's a weird and excellent mix of insanely crazy stories. He's from South Carolina, so I like to tell him he's the second funniest man from South Carolina because as long as Stephen Colbert is still alive, I mean, it's not a fair fight. But he's an extremely funny guy, and he is the best storyteller. But he intersperses these stories with tales of brain science, of cognition, about how we understand the world. And the whole point of this show, Making Up the Truth, is that, in fact, we fill in a great deal of the meaning of what we see. We all know, for example, that the world actually hits our eyeballs upside down and our brain turns it around and makes it correct. Well, what we take to be correct. In Jack's show, he does a whole bunch of stuff about how we do that all the time. We really want to make sense. In fact, our success as a species depends on our being able to make sense of the world one way or another. Well, that's what designers can do. Designers help us make sense of the world. Sometimes they do it in modern design, they do it by focusing on simplicity. Braun, a great German company, which is very well known for design, simplifies things down to try to make an object or product performing its most fundamental task elegant, simply doing that task without need of additional adornment and so forth. Indeed, this Dieter Rams, who's a famous designer at that firm, has designed all kinds of products that you might recognize. But we also can glean from all kinds of sources design ideas. Here's a series of soap bubbles and the Artimedy lights that were inspired by them. We see the myriad of Braun products that are, I think very elegantly designed. We see the original Macintosh, one of the very early Macintoshes, which now it doesn't really look that sleek, does it? It really did at the time, I remember. The idea that the keyboard slid underneath a little bit, the idea that there wasn't a whole bunch of stuff on it, the idea that the mouse had one button. We thought that was very cool. But then it turns out actually Braun had designed almost everything that Mac makes, 30 or 40 years earlier. So we live in a world of cross-pollination. There's hardly anything. Can you believe the similarity between the original iPod and this 1958 pocket radio? But we don't just draw inspiration from the natural world. We draw inspiration from the world from the commercial world as well. So how do we actually go about doing design? I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about that. One is context. For architects, this is second nature. When an architect looks at a site, he or she tries to understand everything that's going on there. The wind, the views, the sun, the light, the neighboring buildings, the scale, all these things, so as to try to operate better. So, for example, the context for a race car might be this racetrack. The context for a Prius might be something like this. Okay? In other words, there are different contexts in which to view what goes on. Then there's also memory. All of these things play a very important part in design, and this will all be revealed in every class meeting. Just trying to, shake the sheets loose a little bit here, so we can dive into the starting this coming Thursday. But I also want to arm you with a little bit of vocabulary, so that both when we're talking with our guests, and then maybe towards the end of the meetings, for you guys to ask questions of our guests. So the notion of memory, people remember things differently. You need to try to understand how they remember something so that you can have access to it. Some people remember this as home, and some people remember this as home. But you need to understand that designers can manipulate the idea of memory. They can make you feel like you are very comfortable with something that maybe hasn't happened to you already. And we'll see examples of that. So this next point is very important. Decontextualize. So wait a minute, you just got through telling me that context was important. Now you're telling me you got to take things out of context. That's usually, by the way, a bad thing, right? When somebody says on television, no, you just took that out of context, that's not a good thing. But actually for a designer, it's a very good thing. Because if you've ever taken a drawing class, for example, how many of you have ever taken a drawing class? Did you ever do an exercise where they had you look at a photograph, maybe even of yourself or some a familiar face, and you draw it, and then you turn it upside down, and you draw it. By turning it upside down, it decontextualizes it so that, let's say that handsome fellow right there, you have that picture, and I say, go ahead and draw that. Well, already, we hardly know each other, and you've already made some connection to a memory of what I look like. But I've asked you to draw that. You actually have to think about it much more self-consciously about, okay, what are the shapes involved? Where is everything? This is no longer a person. This is some upside-down thing that I actually have to focus on. And as a designer, that can make all the difference. So after you decontextualize something, then you can recontextualize it. And by that, I mean something like this. This is the work of one of my colleagues in the School of Architecture, Tim Love. And it is a design for, he's been charged by the city of Boston with redesigning Broad Street. If you know, in downtown Boston, Broad Street, it's not very long, but it's a very old street in the city. And there, what does that mean to redesign a street? You mean like new curbs and new bricks on the sidewalk and new paving? What else do you want? Maybe a decision about whether to put trees in or not. Well, the way Tim and his colleagues recontextualized this issue was to say, well, really the street has a number of opportunities and different kinds of opportunities. Some places along the street are opportunities for cafes and restaurants to have seating that spills out. And then there's also a desire on the part of the city to do what they call traffic calming. You all know that as the frustrating thing for the driver where you have to slow down and drive like this instead of rocketing through a city street. So what they did was they found those buildings. This is a view of the street. They found those buildings that could support restaurants and gave them very wide and deep sidewalks. And then they found other areas where there was office space, and they had those have much narrower sidewalks. And the result, this is a clearer image of that, is that there's some areas with nice big bulbous areas to sit out in front of, and they made areas to plant trees that then also underneath the canopy of these trees, that's what the black dot with the circle around it indicates, they then also created permeable surface where the dark bricks are porous bricks with holes drilled in them that allow rainwater to soak right into the ground rather than go into the sewer system, thereby keeping the water table up higher and therefore not causing us to have to send so much water back into the sewers. This, by the way, for those of you who are from China or are familiar with China, the biggest design challenge that China faces is with the rapid settlement of the urban areas in eastern China. The water table has been plummeting as they need to use water more and more. So they have to find ways, and we have good relations with some excellent Chinese architects who are doing this and landscape architects who are doing this. They need to find ways to do exactly this, to have rainwater stay in their system and not go into the sewers and go out and be lost in them. So the challenge for the designer is, first of all, to know what question it is they're being asked or what problem they need to solve, and then questioning that question. When architects are first start working with a client will often say, "Okay, this is what we need. I need a 4-bedroom house with a 3-car garage, and I need this and this." And a good architect will back it up a little bit and try to understand what it is that, let's say, isn't working about where they currently live, or what some of the performance measures are for the house that they are looking for. And they might end up providing the customer with a clearer notion of what the problem is and what they should be solving. So let's give you an example. What is a car? Well, is it a horseless carriage? Yes. Initially, it absolutely was. So all of the performance criteria for a car initially, and yeah, that's a car. The performance criteria initially were, how do I get my carriage to work without horses? That's it. That's it. Okay? Then it got a little bit more sophisticated, but it was still, for example, the wheels now have some rubber on them, so the ride is not quite so hard. But the idea of having multiple people drive it and you being in the back, like in a carriage, remains, right? So this idea about being driven around persisted even into the 20s. And here's a vehicle that looks much more modern, but still has an open air area for the person driving it and a protected area, much larger and more and fancier for the people in the back. Of course, what was the big change? It was the Model T. Not just because it was affordable, but because it was intended to be driven by you. Right? Suddenly the problem was a different problem. It's not, how can I have my servants drive me around? It's, oh, wait a minute, maybe I could drive around. And that is one of the biggest conceptual distinctions in cars to this day. I mean, the difference between a Maybach and a Ferrari is that you get driven in one and you drive the other. And they look very different for that reason. So then once you were driving it yourself, well, that's a horse of a different color. Then I want to have something that's not a big ponderous thing. I want a race car. And we still do. So are there further stages in this evolution of the car? Sure. There's the sort of commodity, the basic Toyota, let's say, or nowadays maybe the smart car. But our friends at MIT are taking it to the next level, which is the car's infrastructure. Not just zip car, but also the foldable, rackable cars. I don't know if you guys have seen these, but they've been working on this for some time, and it's really quite interesting. So more like Hubway, the bicycle thing, where you just go and you get one, and you can take it back and put it back in a different charging rack. And these foldable electric cars would be used for urban transportation. Well, now, why do people buy cars? That's a different story completely. So we have the practical car. We have the strong person. We have the thoughtful person. I'll let you figure out what that person is thinking about. And then we have the good parent. These cars have different meanings, okay? So when you're in branding and identity and marketing, there are different ways that you have to kind of unpack what is a car. So let's get back to, and I promise I'm not going to keep you too much longer. Let's get back to this question of what is design. Let's try, based on what we've done thus far, a word. A synthesis of attributes that allows something to embody its essence. Okay, I'm going to break that down very quickly. A synthesis implying that it is more than one thing. Attributes or qualities, features. Embody. How can something embody its essence? Through its appearance, through its experience, one's experience of it, through look and feel, to use the word common in software. And its essence might be a task. It might be an emotional core. And so I would say, let's use this for the time being as a working definition of good design. And I think that we will probably modify this, but I would encourage you that in the absence of something better, we might want to use this as something that we bounce off our later essays off of some kind, if not this working definition of good design, then another. Beautiful objects, even as simple as a measuring cup made out of brass, the incredible peacock, an astonishing oak tree. But I'm going to give you some quick examples of what I would say are things that embody the sort of both and nature of design. That is, solving more than one problem at a time. Here's a simple piece of folded metal that is both a table and a book spine saver. It takes advantage of the sharp angle of the bent metal that holds the table up to be the place where you leave your book. Now, what is this? Salt and pepper shaker. You got it. That's exactly right. Of course. Obviously. This is a printer. It's an all-in-one thing, a printer, copier, fax, made by Samsung. And I think what's so astonishing about this is how, what is the problem? Can you take those big clunky things and get them down really, really, really small and really low and take up very little space? And that's what this does. It's pretty impressive. This, not just wireless, but virtual, right? Correct. So I think this is really cool. And when you think about, this is where technology develops and then designers get involved, because somebody invents a technology and they go, wow, this is really cool. I don't know what the hell it's going to do, but it's cool. And then it's the job of others to help figure out what purpose, what uses we could put this to. And I think this is very interesting. If you've ever seen, you can do this at a large, like, spatial outdoor scale. So instead of just where I would type on a keyboard with my fingers, you can do it, out on a plaza, so that people are walking around and typing as they walk, which is kind of interesting. And for those of you who thought your unicycle was too complicated, I thought this was pretty interesting. This I love. It's a table, but it also stores a whole bunch of stuff for those of you who live in small places. This I really like. That's right. The shower. So one of the things that Steve Jobs says, or did say, when he made a presentation was, let me tell you a story. Because he wanted to create a context in which what he was about to introduce to you was essential. Oh my gosh, I didn't know I needed that until right now. Give me one, right? That is the story. And I'm gonna say that these are probably all words that are useful to you in thinking about design and thinking critically about all the different kinds of design you're going to be exposed to. Context, question, empathy, that is feeling for someone else. That's not the same as sympathy. It's not feeling badly for somebody else. Empathy is actually trying to feel for another person. If you're going to design something that someone else is to experience, you have to try to understand how they feel. I'm sorry, whoops. And then iteration is simply the idea of designing something, coming back, looking at it, testing it, and designing it again. Metaphor, we've seen and we'll see further, is very useful for designers coming up with new forms or new ways of looking at things. Visualization is something that architects and graphic designers take for granted, but those of you who are in other fields, you know, the idea of making a sketch or a diagram or just noting something as a visual placeholder is enormously helpful. And that ultimately design is synthesis. It is bringing together disparate elements into one thing. So, you know, what is a music player? It started with just replicating a horn, then the idea of being able to play music for a whole party, then becoming a big piece of furniture, then becoming portable, then becoming really portable, and then, cassette tapes meant that you didn't have to be careful about bouncing it. So we had, that's the tape recorder I had. And that meant you could have a whole 60 minutes of music and take it somewhere. It was really cool. But then we said, no, we need an industrial music player that had a whole bunch of features that we didn't know how to use, and so we could take it with us. And then a revolution, again, before you were born, the Walkman, 1980, changed everything. Suddenly, everybody was walking around listening to their own music. And I'll leave it to the sociologists, but the great author Ann Tyler wrote the best book on this. The Accidental Tourist, I don't know if you've ever seen it. This is about a guy, he's a very successful travel writer, very famous, except he hates to travel. And so anywhere he goes, he tries to recreate his own domestic space. So if he goes to Egypt, he says, the great thing about Egypt was I was able to find a hotel that was almost completely like the one in my hometown. So why did you go there? Anyway, The Accidental Tourist, fantastic book. Then, of course, as we know, the iPod changed everything when instead of taking 60 minutes of music, you could take, quote, 1,000 songs in your pocket, unquote. Ever smaller by creating the so-called digital hub, which meant that you work with your music on your computer and you only take it with you in your device so that the number of buttons could continually reduce. And I don't even have the one on here that actually has no buttons. I finally got it down to where there's no buttons. There's just something on there's a little controller on the earpiece. And then, of course, this was the secret, was to have this whole iTunes business, which allowed you to manage all of your songs on the computer. But even that is now changing, as maybe you don't even have to have the songs anymore. You can just borrow them, or you can even have someone else suggest them for you. So this evolution of the music world is really interesting because it's each time solving a different kind of problem. So I'd revisit this list of qualities and tell you that, of course, as you know, computers have an interesting history. This is around the time my folks were at IBM. That's not my mom. But even when they started to get smaller, this is Wang Computer in the early 1980s. Yes, that was really the name of the computer company. And they would give you 16K for $7,400 32 years ago. And it looks just like an Apple ad to me. You know what I mean? It's got a lot of detail down here, but it's clear graphics. It was at the time a clear device run by cassette tape. But it wasn't until Steve Jobs said, in other words, computers were already getting smaller. But Steve Jobs talked about a computer as a household appliance. He said, like a toaster. Now look at a toaster. Very few buttons, very few things, but ubiquitous. And of course, that's what made this. That's what made that revolution happen, and that revolution happen. Very quickly, and we're going to be done in just a couple minutes. I just want to say a couple things about other methods that designers use. This is a Monet painting. It is an Impressionist painting. It is about using a new way of looking at the world, decontextualizing the world, abstracting the world, not to make it, people often say, oh, I don't know, that's too abstract for me. No. Abstraction is a way of clarifying the world. It just allows you to see different things. What abstraction allows you to do is to focus on one thing, in this case, light. Paintings about light. Not about form, but about light. And it's an enormously powerful tool that I encourage you to think about. If nothing else, when you are looking at something, squint your eyes and try to understand what is the fundamental shape, what is the fundamental contour of the thing you're seeing. It will often reveal things to you. It won't reveal that, though, usually. This is a jaguar, and this is a jaguar. Now, one was really helpful for the designers when designing the other. Okay, the lines, the haunch, the muscular rear leg of the creature inspires the vehicle. We're going to close with this, since we're going to have our guest next time is Chris Hacker, who's the chief designer for Johnson & Johnson. If you have any friends in Beauvais or health sciences who want to drop in, they're more than welcome to visit. It's really, it'll be a very good talk, I think, and a very good conversation. This is Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. We'll be talking about the World War II Memorial in 3 meetings. But Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial is one of the most successful designs, I would say, ever. It's located in that red circle. It connects to 2 existing monuments, Lincoln and Washington. It doesn't look like a monument at all when you're down in Washington, D.C. It looks like a low wall, and you can see why people might have been, this gets automated. You can see why people might have been a little negative about this memorial when it was first built. It wasn't monumentalizing things. It was just a gash in the ground plane. But of course, this has become the most popular and successful memorial in Washington. And it's because it is about ambiguity. It's because it communicates something that people thought really couldn't be communicated, which is both the central part that this memorial plays in our nation's history, but also the personal connections that people feel when they walk by it. They look into this black granite. I'm sure how many of you have been to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial? I'm always impressed with it. Class trips must really go down there a lot because everybody's been to it. But it is so powerful to see in the reflection yourself and the names of the dead. It's unbelievably powerful. And of course, the gentle slope down into the ground is amazing because it sort of parallels the descent into war and the so-called quagmire, and then finally the emergence. So it's a very powerful piece of landscape and abstract art, but in a way, the abstraction is what makes it so powerful. Look at that. That's all it is. Just a cut in the ground. Okay. And I'm just going to fast forward through this. This is another excellent memorial in Columbus, Indiana, but I'm going to leave that for another day because this has gone on slightly. So what we're talking about in this course is, what is design? Is it a process? Is it a thing? Is it a method? Is it a result? We're going to look at all these different types of design in this course. People representing every different type that you see here. I think it's going to be fantastic. I look forward to it with you. And Chris Hacker is our next guest. I'll see you here on Thursday. Thank you very much.